Well, just going back to what Owen started with, which was just about the revolving door, or about the demographic that stocks our media, which is people like Nick Robinson, who was head of the Young Conservatives at the university. That is something I can give you sort of anecdotal evidence for. At the FT, there was a guy called Joe Johnson, who was head of the Lex column, which is the top column at the FT, hugely influential globally. He went straight to being the director of the Tory party policy department. And when I first started at the FT, they said to me, "Oh, you'll probably leave when you hit 40 or 35 when you have kids, because you're not going to be able to afford private school with this wage at the FT, which has a minimum like any journalist who's trained, which is actually quite positive for the FT, but their minimum journalists at the FT will earn 40 grand. But anyway, they were saying you'll probably leave and go into PR, and that's what a lot of them do. You have to understand that these are the same people. They don't see themselves as adversarial to people in banking or PR, which they should be. I mean, any journalist that works for 20 years covering banks and then goes and works for a bank is doing something wrong. They should hate you. They shouldn't want you in there. But the fact is, they're the same people. They're the same, as Ellie says, the zero man. They're all the same. They're white. They're privately educated. They go to work in a suit, and they just go in between these doors of power. And and if you try and get in there, they'll kick you out. And that's how it works. That's how the power system works to replicate itself. Because as soon as you get in there, I mean, I guarantee this book won't be reviewed in the FT. In fact, maybe it won't, because it will be savaged. But that's because they don't know how to deal with someone who doesn't subscribe. They think you're, as I said earlier, they can't. There's so many effective ways of shutting down dissent, and one of them is to say you're immature, you're a maverick, just very patronising things. You're too young, and it's a very effective way. And what it means is you don't accept the prevailing ideology like we do. Which should be a badge of honour, but in these places they just see it as like you're some sort of weirdo. What, you don't want to become part of the global empire with us? No, I don't. So it's but I think it's totally true what Ellie says, and obviously I can't talk to it because I'm not working class or a woman. But I'm middle class, but I wasn't of the same demographic as a lot of the journalists in the FT, and there's so many different. It's exactly what Ellie says. It's like there was this sort of patronising, like, oh, you're very edgy, aren't you? You like, because I didn't go to private school, you don't speak with a posh accent. It's just, and it sounds anecdotal and stupid, but it's such a powerful way of keeping people out of the power structure, because you're just not like them. And to be in an institution where you're different to everyone else is basically psychologically impossible.
It's funny, I mean, if you support the status quo in the media, then they regard you as nuanced and thoughtful and grown up. And if you oppose it, then you're predictable. Yeah. And childish and immature. Yeah. And it's funny that, because if you're on the very few left-wingers in the mainstream media, they're often told to not be predictable and to be surprising, which in practice means you attack your own side and the prevailing wisdom of the left. And I think the totally hegemonic right-wing consensus has that one covered. Yeah. I think they did quite a good job of that. I don't think I can add to that very well. I think they're far better than me. But it comes back to the Overton window. Do people know about this? Yeah. I'm obsessed with this concept. It's a right-wing concept introduced in the United States. It's named after...
Boy, is it a good concept.
It is a bloody good concept.
Great concept. It's one of my favourite concepts.
Of all the concepts, you could give me a better concept. Anyway, it's named after Philip Overton. He was a right-wing think tanker, and he died a few years ago. And basically, the idea is everything within the Overton window is seen as common sense, mainstream. That's just the way the world is, centre ground, whatever. Everything outside the window is seen as extreme, fringe, deluded, what planet do you live on? And what happens is the right shifted the Overton window. So ideas which were once seen as mainstream became seen as extreme, and ideas which were once extreme became seen as mainstream. So the idea of running the railways for profit was seen as completely wacky. And it's the same with, slashing taxes on the rich, smashing the power of the trade unions. Yeah. And equally, what are now Keynesian economics are seen as kind of left-wing extremism. But in the 1970s, conservatives, Richard Nixon, who Chomsky called the last liberal president, he's certainly liberal at bombing people, but he was also domestically liberal in that sense. And he said we're all Keynesians now. But now to be a Keynesian is seen as kind of like you're a left-wing fundamentalist. So it's interesting, that Overton window is very carefully policed by the media, by right-wing think tanks, by economists, because the academy have been emptied of even Keynesian economists. And if you get dissident economists now, they're generally in the School of Geography or something. They've often put in different departments. So it's interesting that into the Overton window, that's what we have to shift. because most people actually, publicly, they support, the public want renationalisation, higher taxes on the rich, they oppose these wars, but that's seen as deluded and outside the Overton window.
Well, that's what I think is really interesting about the era that we're living at the moment. At the moment, I mean, I don't know whether there are any other comparable eras, but I think at the moment we're living in an era where what is considered politically acceptable in politics and the media is actually miles and miles away from what the public actually want and consider politically acceptable. There's a guy called Alistair Heath who used to he used to be the editor of City AM, and he now writes for The Telegraph. And when the think tank that I work for, Class, released a series of polls showing that the public were largely in favour of renationalising of pretty much every key industry that we have, he wrote this kind of sort of hysterical piece where he was like, oh my God, they want to take us back to, we're all going to live in caves, you know, like, what have we done?
He called them socialist. He said atavistic socialism had been embraced by the public.
Yeah, and I think I think that's really interesting. And I don't know whether there's really been any other comparable era where there's such a massive chasm. And I'm not really a sort of, I don't get very excited about the idea of, the public are just this sleeping giant ready to be woken up so they can have revolution. I'm not really that kind of person, but I do sort of wonder, like, how long can that last? You know, how long can there be that gap? It doesn't feel like it's...
Tell them about UKIP voters.
Oh, yeah, so UKIP voters in this poll are even more to the left than the sort of average voter. So the votes were broken down by... So you have, like, the kind of mean, which is sort of your average Joe, and then you have, then it would be broken down by party. And UKIP voters were actually to the left of the average voter, so they're more likely to be in favour of nationalisation. And that's so strange. And I just think you think not really. Not.
Well, the brown shirts believe in nationalisation.
Well, but yes, I mean, well, I sort of get really sort of reluctant to make that comparison. Not with Nigel Farage so much, who used to sing Nazi chants in his private school, so I think maybe that comparison is slightly, maybe a little
But also
bit more.
the business community did back Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
It's kind of they called themselves the National Socialists, but they were massively backed by the business sector.
They weren't
But I mean,
we just knocked them out. They weren't socialists.
But I think I think though the difference with UKIP is that I suppose the interesting thing is with UKIP is not so much that comparing to previous right-wing regimes. It's more that UKIP is an overtly neoliberal pro-privatisation party, but it's backed by people who are to the left of the average voter and who want nationalisation. And I just think I don't really have any kind of definitive conclusions to draw from that, and I don't really know what's going to come of that. But I suppose instinctively I feel that can't last, can it? Can that last? That there's such a huge gap between what the public want and what is happening, you know, especially at a time at the moment of very strong economic uncertainty and something that we haven't brought up yet, a climate crisis, which is going to destroy everything within 50 years anyway. And, and I just kind of wonder...
Way to put a downer.
Wow, let's be honest. You know.
But, I mean, can I just come a bit on that? Mm-hmm. The Overton window that Owen's talking about, and Ellie as well, it's not static, it changes all the time. So part of the book, it talks about when I was in New York for the Occupy movement. And obviously in the United States, the spectrum is even more constricted than here. But when the Occupy movement happened, when CNN and others got over, they're sort of like, oh my God, these are aliens, homeless people who we don't quite know what they're doing. When they got over that, the debate changed massively and very quickly. People were discussing inequality on CNN in ways that I would never even think were possible. And I just think that this window of acceptable debate, which is definitely policed massively, but it's policed so hard because they're scared that if they lose their left flank, people like Syriza will rise up who came in Greece and Podemos. And it's totally true what you're saying. And it's very strange to look at the world because, I mean, as it is now, because Nicola Sturgeon in the debate was the SNP leader. She basically just came out with policies that should be a standard Labour policy. She said the NHS should have no private input, which Miliband's defended PFI hospitals, which have been an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. She defended immigrants. She acted like a human being, and she was a star overnight.
And
people watched it, and she was all the women on that debate just absolutely killed the men.
Yeah, they did.
But that was really interesting. Overnight, she became a massive star. And that was because people watched that without the mediation of the Daily Mail and all these people, and they thought, well, this is a woman that really knows what she's talking about and has my interests at heart. And you're totally right. And then I remember the next day they said the most Googled thing the day after was, how can I vote SNP in England? And you're like, well, if that's the case, why doesn't Miliband just move to the left and take all those votes off her? And the fact is, I think it's quite interesting what Ellie said. And Owen, it's about how our society has been massively taken over by corporations. And they run our media, they increasingly run our NHS, they run our schools, academy schools have private input. And what that means is they're not there, it's not easy to pinpoint, but the structural effect of that is you massively constrict debate and you can't criticize corporate power. And that's what Miliband comes up against the whole time. The same people that would lose out if the railways are nationalised are the same people that own the newspapers. So obviously, structurally, it's just impossible for him, if his policies are all about how is this going to appear in the Daily Mail, he's not going to win. And I mean, if he loses, the Labour Party will be ruined because they're like many of these parties, they're basically going against their base. The Labour Party base has traditionally been the working class, who they've tended to sell out quite regularly anyway, but that's their traditional base and they voted for them because they at least had some semblance that they were their base. Now they don't care at all. They represent corporate interests. So where do working class people go? They think, oh, well, there's no one on the Green Party, they're a load of hippies. That UKIP seem like they're against the consensus. I think it's a bit too easy to say all UKIPers are just racist nutters, which is what a lot of the left do. And it's the same in the US with the Tea Party. The Tea Party's demographic is actually poor people, a lot of working class people that are massively propagandized by corporate power. The Koch brothers, in the case of what they call an AstroTurf movement, because they pretend to be grassroots, but they're actually paid for by the Koch brothers. But they propagandize them, and they take. This is a very effective way of corporate control. Is they take issues out. They know that people on benefits aren't going to support policies which cut benefits. So what they do is this is in the States. They move the debate away from social issues or labour. So that, like corporate executives, they love everyone arguing. I mean, gay rights is obviously an important thing, but they love these massive, what they call social wars, so about abortion, because it takes the mind of the population off social issues which hurt the bottom line. All they care about is the bottom line. They don't care. Most of them, people, they have gay kids, or there's this. I think Chomsky said that a capitalist doesn't care if there's a black gay person in a limousine. What they want is the limousine there. That's the way it works.
Yeah, but 68,000 women a year do die from illegal abortion because of abortion.
No, I'm not saying it's not an important issue, but what I'm saying corporations might. The fact
I
that
don't think it's helpful to put different kinds of oppression in a league table like that. Because
no, I'm not.
Always leave
I think they should all be
behind.
fought. But what I'm saying, I'm just merely making analysis about why corporations don't mind us talking about that. Whether that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. I'm just saying that there's a very we talk about I'm speaking specifically about America here because social wars are massive there, and that's how elections are won. The Republicans ran a strategy in the South called the Southern Strategy, where they basically just knew that if they came out of racist stuff, they'd win.
Well, that's the point you're making. It's not. I mean, those issues, those struggles have to be fought.
Of course,
we owe everything to our ancestors who fought at great cost for them and people who fight today. But I mean, the issue is that they redirect people's anger constantly away from those at the top to people down the street. And what they do so cleverly is the politics of envy, which we're often accused of. You know, if you say the wealth of the richest 1,000 people has doubled in this country during one of the great economic traumas of our time, whilst 1 million people have been driven to food banks, which sums up just how bankrupt this society is. If you say that, you know, those people should pay a bit more money, politics of envy, they come back. You know, you stand up for the bottom 70%, you're a class warrior, you stand up for the top 1%, you're a moderate. But actually, what they do is they push the politics of envy amongst struggling people. So they say to people who are low-paid workers, their wages cut by their bosses, their in-work benefits cut by the government, don't be angry with your boss, don't be angry with the government, envy the unemployed scrounger down the road living in luxury in a mansion made out of widescreen television sets. And they say to private sector workers have had their pensions decimated. It's one of the great scandals of our time. But they say, don't be angry with your boss. Envy the nurse, the teacher, the public sector worker whose pension is still intact. Why should they have a pension when you don't? And they say, if you can't get an affordable home because governments won't build them, or you can't get a secure job because they've been stripped from the economy through basically policies of economic vandalism, don't be angry with the powerful. Envy the immigrant getting the job or the home. That should be yours instead. And what they're saying all the time to us is you've been robbed But don't be angry at the fact you're being robbed. Be angry your less deserving neighbour hasn't been robbed quite as much as you have.
Yeah.
And that politics of divide and rule is so effective.
And it's as old as capitalism, because one of the major contradictions within capitalism is the contradiction between capital and labour. They hate the fact that labour is a check on capital's power. So the easiest way to get around that is to turn labour against each other. And I think that's one of the things that they have actually won, because reporting this book, you see that the working class, which we kind of understand existed 50 years ago, is completely fractured now. People, through various different mechanisms, free trade agreements, different tax regimes that have been imposed on countries, or the absence of tax regimes, they've really turned labour against each other. So, and what academics call the race to the bottom. So the most successful labour force is the one that has the least regulations. So they have the lowest minimum wage, they have the worst environmental regulations, and basically that's a method that capitalists have used since capitalism existed. Because, as you say, if we were actually rational and an engaged population, we'd realise that our enemies aren't black people or gay people. They're the people at the top that are exploiting us. And when when you read the Daily Mail is the perfect example of that. I mean, every day you're meant to read it and just hate everyone.
Exactly.
And why?
Just on what Ellie said, I mean, I know this isn't what you're trying to say, but I mean, it's just because there's always I know this isn't what you're saying, by the way, but there's always this tendency on the left sometimes to think we deal just with economic oppression and, women's rights and gay rights and anti-race, that can wait till kind of after the revolution. And obviously these struggles actually are not interlinked, aren't they? They all come together. And obviously it's true they exploit homophobia and misogyny and racism in order to divide us against each other. But we battle against that by uniting together and linking those struggles against the oppression of women, of gay people, of minorities, and we link with that broader struggle, don't we, against oppression? I think.
I just wanted to say that I need to go. And ironically, after talking about the racket and how crap all the political parties are, I actually have to just go to cover the debates, which are happening now. But I will just be sitting there, so I'm not leaving. So come and say hello to me afterwards. The last note that I wanted to leave is the SNP did actually wave through the biggest privatisation contract in the NHS in Scotland. And I think what we can take from that is parliamentary democracy is not the answer.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
that bombshell.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Thanks, Ellie.
sorry.